There are battles remembered by the losers, and there are battles where the winners are silenced for a century. Little Bighorn is the second kind. Everything you know about Custer's last stand was written by the side that lost. The side that won had a different story. And it begins with a 13-year-old boy and a knife that would not cut clean. A boy kneels in the dust beside a dying soldier on a Montana hillside. The soldier's legs are still kicking. The boy's knife is dull, and it will not cut through cleanly. So he presses the barrel of a gun to the man's forehead and pulls the trigger and finishes what he started. His name is Black Elk. He is an Oglala Lakota, a second cousin of Crazy Horse, and he is 13 years old on this June afternoon in 1876. The soldier grinds his teeth, a sound so specific, so intimate, that it could not be invented. It is the sound of a man's jaw clenching against pain and terror in the last seconds of his life. Black Elk will remember that sound for 60 years. He will carry it through the destruction of his people, through the reservations, through Wounded Knee, through decades of silence. And when he finally tells his story, America will not listen, because America had already written a different version. A version where the losers were heroes and the winners were savages. A version that turned a military catastrophe caused by one man's arrogance into a noble last stand against overwhelming odds. A version that served a purpose, and the purpose was to justify everything that came after: the reservations, the buffalo slaughter, the children taken from their families and sent to schools designed to erase their language and their memory. Wounded Knee. All of it justified by a story about savage Indians who murdered a brave American soldier. The real story was simpler and more terrible. The brave American soldier attacked a village full of families. The families defended themselves, and they won. In 1868, the United States government signed the Treaty of Fort Laramie. The language was clear. The Black Hills of South Dakota, land the Lakota considered sacred, the center of their world, belonged to them. The treaty guaranteed it. The United States of America put its name on a piece of paper and promised. Then, in 1874, an expedition led by George Armstrong Custer confirmed the presence of gold in those same Black Hills. Prospectors flooded in by the thousands. The government, instead of honoring its own treaty and removing the trespassers, demanded that the Lakota sell the land. When they refused, Washington issued an ultimatum: report to designated reservations by January 31, 1876, or be declared hostile. The government signed a treaty. Then it found gold. Then it forgot the treaty. That is not a simplification. That is exactly what happened. A nation's word, written on paper, signed by officials, witnessed by chiefs who had traveled hundreds of miles to negotiate in good faith, was broken the moment something valuable was found underneath the land it promised to protect. The Lakota did not misunderstand the treaty. The United States did not misunderstand the treaty. The treaty was clear, and it was broken deliberately because gold is worth more than a signature to men who have never had to live on the land they are selling. Many bands refused the ultimatum. Sitting Bulls Hunkpapa Lakota, Crazy Horses Oglala, Northern Cheyenne, Arapaho. They gathered as they always had for their annual summer encampment, this time in the valley of the Little Bighorn River, the valley they called the Greasy Grass, for the lush vegetation that grew thick along its banks. They were not preparing for war, they were living their lives. The United States Army launched a three-pronged campaign to force them onto reservations. 3 columns of soldiers marching into Lakota territory from different directions. It did not go well for the Army. Crazy Horse rarely wore a war bonnet. Before battle, he tied a single hawk feather in his hair and dusted his face with dry earth. He was quiet, almost reclusive, the kind of man who said little and did much. On June 17th, 8 days before Little Bighorn, he met General George Crook's column of 1,300 soldiers at the Battle of the Rosebud. Crook was one of the most experienced Indian fighters in the Army. Crazy Horse stopped him cold. Crook retreated and played no further role in the campaign. In 3 months, Crazy Horse had humiliated 2 American military expeditions. A third was on its way. Sitting Bull, the Hunkpapa spiritual leader, had recently performed a sun dance, one of the most sacred ceremonies in Lakota spiritual life. During the ritual, he offered pieces of his own flesh and fell into a trance. In that trance, he received a vision: soldiers falling upside down into the Lakota camp, tumbling headfirst from the sky like leaves. The people interpreted this as prophecy. The soldiers will come, and they will die. Within 8 days, that vision would come true so literally that even the skeptics would remember it for the rest of their lives. One detail tells you everything you need to know about George Armstrong Custer. He graduated dead last in his West Point class of 1861, and yet rose to brevet major general during the Civil War by the age of 25, through sheer audacity and a willingness to charge when other men hesitated. Custer craved glory the way other men craved safety. By 1876, he desperately needed a victory to salvage a career tarnished by political scandal and a public dispute with President Grant. He was not riding toward the greasy grass with caution. He was riding with hunger. There is a word for a man who graduates last in his class, rises to general by 25, and rides into battle against impossible odds believing he will win. The word is not brave. The word is addicted. Addicted to the rush that only comes from betting everything on yourself and being right. At Little Bighorn, the addiction killed him. He had refused Gatling guns offered for the expedition because they would slow his march. He had refused additional cavalry reinforcements from the 2nd Cavalry because he wanted the glory for the 7th alone. His Crow and Araucarian scouts had warned him emphatically that the village was enormous, far larger than anything they had ever seen. One scout reportedly told him there were more Lakota warriors in that valley than his regiment had bullets. Think about that. A man whose job was to keep the army alive told his commander that the enemy had more fighters than the army had ammunition, and the commander's response was not to wait for reinforcements or reconsider his approach. His response was to ride faster. Custer dismissed the warnings. He was not worried that the Indians would fight. He was worried they would scatter before he could attack. His response to being told he was outnumbered was to ride faster. On the morning of June 25th, Custer made the decision that would destroy him. He split his regiment into 3 groups. Captain Frederick Benteen took 125 men to scout the bluffs to the southwest, effectively removing them from the coming fight. Major Marcus Reno took approximately 140 men with orders to cross the river and charge the village from the south. Custer himself took roughly 210 men and rode north along the bluffs east of the river, planning to strike the village from the opposite end. A classic pincer movement. The plan required coordination between separated units, speed of execution, and a small disorganized enemy. None of these conditions existed. Custer divided 600 men into 3 groups, sent them in 3 directions, and rode toward a force that outnumbered his entire regiment several times over. He believed he was about to win the greatest victory of his career. The Little Bighorn River cuts through a wide valley in southeastern Montana. Cottonwood trees line the water, their leaves flickering silver in the wind. To the east, bluffs rise sharply, broken, rugged terrain slashed by ravines and dry coulées. To the west, open prairie rolls toward the Bighorn Mountains, the grass still green in late June. Along the river, stretching for nearly 3 miles, sat the largest gathering of Plains Indians in living memory. This was not a war camp. This was a summer congregation. Families, elders, children, horses by the thousands, grazing in herds so large they darkened the hillsides. Teepees were arranged in tribal circles following ancient custom. Hunkpapa at the southern end, Oglala further north, northern Cheyenne and Arapaho beyond them. The smell of sage and dried meat carried on the wind. Smoke from cooking fires drifted in the morning air. Children swam in the river. Dogs barked at nothing. It was a city of hide and canvas, and it was enormous. Estimates of the total population range from 7,000 to 10,000 people, including warriors, women, children, and elders. The horse herds alone numbered in the tens of thousands. From the bluffs to the east, the camp would have looked like a river of its own, a parallel stream of white teepees and movement stretching for 3 miles alongside the water. Black Elk's family was camped with the Oglala near the Hunkpapa Circle. He was a boy among warriors, watching, listening, carrying a vision that had burned inside him since childhood. The thunder beings of his dream were about to arrive, and they would arrive wearing blue uniforms. The fighting force within this city was formidable. Estimates place the number of warriors between 1,500 and 2,500. Many carried repeating rifles, Winchesters and Henrys captured or traded from previous engagements, alongside bows, lances, war clubs, and revolvers. Some carried weapons taken from Crook's men just 8 days earlier at the Rosebud. These were not disorganized raiders. Many were veterans of that fight. They had tasted American defeat, and they were confident. The Springfield carbine that Custer's soldiers carried fired 1 round, then required the shooter to manually eject the spent casing and load a fresh cartridge before firing again. The repeating rifles many warriors carried could fire multiple rounds without reloading. This was a critical disadvantage that Custer either did not know about or did not care about. It would prove fatal within hours. Early afternoon, women are digging wild turnips near the river. Children play in the shallows. Then dust to the south, a rising cloud, the sound of hooves, faint at first, then unmistakable, gunfire. Reno's 140 troopers come charging across the flats toward the Hunkpapa Circle at the southern end of the camp. For a terrible moment, there is panic. Women grab children and run north through the circles. The shouts go up. Warriors calling to each other, "Be brave! Do not be like a woman!" Men scramble for weapons and horses, some still pulling on war shirts as they mount. But the panic is brief. Chief Gall, the Hunkpapa war leader, rallies the defense with ferocious speed. He has personal fury driving him beyond any sense of military duty. His wives and children were among the first casualties of Reno's charge. The opening volley that was supposed to scatter the camp had instead killed the family of the man who would now organize its defense. Think about what that does to a human being. The soldiers who shot his family did not know whose teepee they were firing into. They did not need to know. They were firing into a camp full of families because their orders said the people in that camp were hostile. Gall's grief became a weapon more devastating than any rifle. The man who had just lost everything organized a counterattack that closed on Reno's men like a vice. Within minutes, the skirmish line buckled. Reno ordered retreat. First into timber along the river, then a chaotic, desperate scramble across the water and up the steep bluffs to the east. The retreat became a rout. Men cut down as they fled, horses stumbling in mud and throwing their riders, soldiers clawing up the hillside, while warriors fired into the mass of blue uniforms below. Dust so thick it blotted out the sun along the river bottom. The copper smell of blood mixing with gunpowder and sage. Some men made it across the river. Some did not. The water ran red downstream for hours. Black Elk, from his position near the Hunkpapa Circle, watched the chaos unfold. He had hidden briefly in the trees. The sound was deafening. Gunfire, war cries, screaming horses, the splash of men falling into the river. He was 13 years old, and the world was exploding around him. Reno's surviving men dug in on the bluff tops, bleeding, disorganized, and effectively out of the fight. They would stay pinned there for the next day and a half, and now the warriors turned their attention north. This was the hinge of the entire battle. With Reno neutralized, hundreds, then over 1,000 warriors began streaming north along the river, and through the ravines toward the sound of new gunfire. Custer's column had been spotted on the bluffs to the east. Crazy Horse was among those moving through the ravines, cutting off any possibility of retreat. The fist was closing. Custer's 210 men were alone on a ridge with no escape route and no hope of reinforcement. The warriors who had chased Reno up the bluffs did not rest. They wheeled north. From the west and south, more warriors surged up from the river valley. Crazy Horse led a force through the ravines to the north and east, sealing the last route of retreat. The encirclement was complete. The first moments of contact on the ridge were devastating. Soldiers dismounted, some shooting their own horses and dragging the carcasses into rough circles to serve as barricades. They crouched behind the bodies of dead cavalry mounts and fired outward. The Springfields barked, loud, deliberate, one shot at a time. The repeating rifles answered in rapid succession from every direction. The slow, measured crack of single shots, answered by the staccato hammering of Winchesters from every ravine. Hundreds of guns firing at once. War cries from every fold in the earth. Dust rising in columns so thick they were visible for miles. Black Elk was moving with the mass of warriors toward the ridge. Around him, men he had known his entire life were riding into the smoke. He was 13 years old, and he was inside the thunder. The vision that had burned in him since childhood, the thunder beings descending in storms of power, was no longer a dream playing behind his closed eyes. It was happening around him, in the screaming and the dust and the gunfire. The thunder beings had arrived. They were not spirits from the sky. They were Lakota and Cheyenne warriors on painted horses, riding through smoke into the teeth of American guns. And Black Elk was among them. The ridge was surrounded. There was no line of retreat. There was no relief column coming. And then he saw him, a soldier on the ground, still alive, still kicking, short hair, not an officer, just a trooper, young, wounded, dying. Black Elk approached. There was a soldier on the ground, and he was still kicking. He had short hair, and my knife was not very sharp. He ground his teeth. Then I shot him in the forehead and got his scalp. Those are Black Elk's own words, spoken decades later. Do not rush past them. His knife is dull. It will not cut cleanly. The soldier grinds his teeth, a jaw clenching against pain and terror. A sound so specific that it could not be invented, and Black Elk remembers it for 60 years. He will tell it to a white poet in a small room in Nebraska in 1931. And the poet will write it down, and the book will go out of print, and the story will be forgotten, and then rediscovered, and then finally believed. But in this moment, on this hillside, Black Elk is not thinking about history. He is thinking about the knife and the scalp and the sound the man made, and the fact that his hands are shaking. This is not bloodlust. This is a boy doing what the warriors around him are doing. In a world where taking an enemy's scalp is an act of honor, proof of courage earned in the most direct way possible. Black Elk is becoming a warrior in real time in the middle of the most violent hour of his life. He is 13. He is covered in blood that is not his own, and the battle is not over. The fighting on the ridge reached its terminal phase. The soldiers who remained alive had pulled into a shrinking perimeter at the top of the hill. Dead horses formed crude barricades. The desperate geometry of men who knew they were going to die. Warriors fired arrows in high arcs that dropped behind the horse barricades, falling among the soldiers from above. The Springfield carbines began to jam. Soft copper cartridge casings expanded in overheated barrels. Troopers clawed desperately at stuck rounds with their knives, trying to pry them free. The weapons that were supposed to be their lifeline were failing in their hands. One moment stands out in the oral histories. Warriors spotted a soldier hiding in thick brush on the slope below the ridge. They could not easily reach him, so they did what hunters do. They shot arrows into the brush, the way you would flush a rabbit from tall grass. When the arrows did not drive him out, they set the brush on fire. The soldier emerged, stumbling and coughing. They hunted him the way they hunted game, with patience, fire, and arrows. He never had a chance. The chaos was not glorious. It was not choreographed. It was dust and blood and confusion. Warriors firing on each other's shadows, soldiers screaming, horses thrashing on the ground with broken legs. Victory up close looks nothing like the paintings. The perimeter collapsed inward as warriors surged over the barricades of dead horses. War clubs, knives, pistols discharged at arm's length. Some soldiers turned their weapons on themselves rather than face what was coming. The firing sputtered, thinned, then stopped. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, though the entire fight on the ridge had lasted perhaps an hour, there was something approaching silence. Dust hung in the air like fog. The smell was staggering. Gunpowder, blood, horse entrails, burned brush drifting up from the slopes below. Warriors moved among the fallen. Bodies were stripped of weapons, ammunition, and clothing. Some were mutilated. These were acts rooted in spiritual belief, intended to weaken the enemy in the afterlife, to prevent the dead from fighting again in the spirit world. They were not random savagery, though American newspapers would describe them as nothing else for the next century. The mutilation had meaning to the people who performed it. The fact that white America could not understand that meaning does not make it meaningless. Custer's body was found with 2 wounds, relatively untouched. His famous golden curls were already gone. He had cut his hair short before the campaign. The myth of the long-haired hero dying in a blaze of glory was false before the body was even cold. Dawn, on June 26th. On Last Stand Hill, roughly 210 soldiers lay dead. Not one survived. Total American casualties across the broader engagement reached 268 killed. Lakota and Cheyenne losses were far lighter. Estimates range from 30 to over 100 killed. The victors tended to their fallen with ceremony and grief. The dead soldiers were left where they fell. The massive camp had to move. Terry and Gibbon's column was approaching. Thousands of people and tens of thousands of horses began flowing toward the Bighorn Mountains. A nation in motion. Then a cry went up. Soldiers coming. Warriors grabbed weapons. Women seized children. Then laughter. Relief breaking like a wave. The approaching figures were not soldiers. They were Lakota warriors wearing captured cavalry uniforms. Blue tunics, campaign hats, boots stripped from the dead on the ridge. Someone blew a captured cavalry bugle, sounding notes that meant nothing in any military language, but were enough to send people running before the truth registered. A moment of dark humor underscored by genuine anxiety. The battle was won, but the war was not. Black Elk moved with his family, carrying the scalp, carrying memories that would haunt and sustain him for the rest of his long life. The valley of the greasy grass shrank behind them. The cottonwoods along the river grew smaller. The smoke from the cooking fires that had risen that morning from a city of 10,000 people thinned and disappeared. They would never gather there in such numbers again. The valley that had held the largest congregation of Plains Indians in living memory would become a national monument dedicated to the man who attacked it. Not to the people who defended it. He was 13 years old. He had killed. He had taken a scalp. He had survived the most famous battle in the history of the American West. And he did not yet know that America would spend the next century pretending he did not exist. Within weeks of the news reaching Eastern newspapers, the narrative was fixed in place like a railroad spike. Custer was a hero martyred by savages. Paintings appeared showing a noble Custer standing tall with pistol raised, surrounded by a swirling mass of feathered warriors. These images bore no resemblance to the chaotic, dust-choked reality that Black Elk described. The confusion, the friendly fire, the soldiers shooting their own horses for cover, the jammed spring fields, the dust so thick no one could see. But the myth served a purpose. It justified everything that came after. Full-scale military campaigns crushed the remaining free bands within 2 years. Crazy Horse surrendered in 1877 and was killed under suspicious circumstances at Fort Robinson. The man who said little and did much was stabbed with a bayonet while in military custody. Sitting Bull fled to Canada, eventually returned, and was shot dead by reservation police in 1890. The great buffalo herds that sustained the entire Plains Indian way of life were systematically slaughtered, not by hunters feeding families, by professionals hired to destroy an economy. Millions of animals shot, skinned, and left to rot on the open prairie. The bones whitened in the sun for years. You do not need to burn a nation to destroy it. You only need to kill what it eats. And when the buffalo were gone, the Lakota had nothing left to eat except what the reservations provided, which was the point. And then came Wounded Knee, December 29, 1890. The 7th Cavalry, Custer's own regiment. They surrounded a band of Lakota at Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota and opened fire. More than 250 Lakota were killed. Most of them were women and children. Bodies were found scattered across a mile of frozen prairie. Women shot in the back while running. Children shot beside their mothers. A baby found alive beneath the body of the woman who had tried to shield it. Some historians have called it revenge. Others have called it a massacre. The Army called it a battle and awarded 20 medals of honor. It was carried out under the authority of the United States government. 14 years after the Greasy Grass, the same regiment came back, and this time there were no warriors to stop them. Black Elk was there. He was 27 years old. He had survived Little Bighorn as a boy, and now he watched the aftermath of Wounded Knee as a man. The bodies in the snow, the frozen postures of women who had tried to shield their children, the silence that followed the last gunshot. He carried both days inside him for the rest of his life. Lakota voices, Black Elks, Galls, the Northern Cheyenne oral histories were dismissed as unreliable, the self-serving stories of defeated people, but they told the same story from multiple angles with remarkable consistency. America was not listening. Black Elk's account did not reach the public until 1932, 56 years after the battle, when the poet John Neihardt published Black Elk Speaks. Even then, the testimony was filtered through a white intermediary, shaped by Neihardt's literary sensibilities and largely ignored for decades. The book went out of print. It was rediscovered in the 1960s during a broader cultural reckoning, but it was not until late 20th century archaeology at the battlefield site itself that Black Elk's testimony was fully recognized for what it was, one of the most vivid, accurate, and devastating eyewitness accounts of the battle ever recorded. The archaeologists came with their tools and their methods and their careful scientific objectivity. In 1983, a prairie fire burned the grass cover off the battlefield, and a team led by archaeologist Richard Fox began the first systematic excavation of Last Stand Hill. They mapped cartridge casing patterns on the hillside. Each casing could be matched to a specific weapon. The patterns showed exactly where individual warriors had positioned themselves and how they moved during the fight. The locations matched Lakota oral history exactly. They analyzed body positions on Last Stand Hill. The positions matched accounts the historians had dismissed for a century. They found evidence of close combat on the ridge, bone fractures consistent with hand-to-hand fighting, aligned precisely with what the Lakota had been saying all along. The unreliable voices turned out to be the most reliable sources of all. Go back to where we began. A 13-year-old boy kneeling in the dust of a Montana hillside, a dull knife. A dying man's teeth grinding against a silence that would last 100 years. That boy grew into a holy man who spent his life trying to preserve the spiritual traditions of a people the United States tried to erase. He watched the buffalo vanish. He watched the reservations close in. He stood at Wounded Knee when the 7th Cavalry came back for revenge. And through all of it, through the losses, the silence, the deliberate forgetting, he remembered. America told the story of the Little Bighorn for over a century without ever asking the people who won it what happened. When it finally did, the answer was the same one Black Elk had given all along. A boy knelt in the dust with a dull knife and a dying man's teeth grinding against the silence of a century to come. He became a holy man who watched his world collapse. And then the archaeologists came, and the cartridge casings matched, and the bone fractures matched, and the positions of the dead matched, and everything the Lakota had been saying for 100 years turned out to be true. The winners told the truth, the losers wrote the history, and it took a century and a shovel to set the record straight.